Toothless, Scene 2, The Junkyard, Part 2. Bizarria's screams pierced the air as the gremlin continued to bite her head and tear at her hair. The furry monster kept moving from side to side, causing Bizarria to stumble and sway. She reached desperately into her coat and pulled out her magic hat. Bizarria, hat trick, versus gremlin, dodge. 4 versus 2. Bizarria succeeds. Moving with the smoothness of a well-practiced magician, Bizarria the Magi flicked her wrist to pop open the top hat. With that same movement, she swung the hat over her head and caught the gremlin in it. She lost her balance, and they both tumbled to the ground, but Bizarria rolled back to her feet. The gremlin was nearby, its top half stuck in the upturned hat. Stubby legs kicked wildly and angry. Muffled growls could be heard from the entrapped top half of the monster. Bizarria quickly grabbed the hat's brim and stomped the rest of the gremlin into her magic hat. The muffled growls went quiet, and Bizarria sat down next to her upturned hat, taking a moment to breathe. A shrill scream burst from the top hat, causing her to reflexively jump away. That was not the scream of a gremlin. Horror and sadness hit the magician harder than any charging gremlin as she realized what was screaming. "Bunny!" she cried in despondent terror.
"It's a hat of devouring," cheered Curly as he scanned for his next target.
Was this experience supposed to be horror or just horrible? Asked Bez.
"I don't think that rabbit's coming back."
No, probably not. Bez looked woefully at her hat. Squealing, growling, and the rushing of tiny feet could be heard. Bizarria turned around to see another gremlin charging for her. The Magi reacted. Gremlin, tackle, versus Bizarria, hat trick. 2 versus 5. Bizarria succeeds. Bizarria reflexively shielded herself with the magic hat. To her utter amazement, she caught another gremlin in her hat. Like before, the stout, furry little monster did not fit well through the opening. The Magi quickly kicked and stomped the second gremlin the rest of the way into the top hat.
"Be careful,"
warned Curly as he smirked.
"Next time you reach in there to pull that rabbit out, your hand might just get bitten off instead."
The Magi popped her top hat closed, then tucked the flat disc back into her jacket, not wanting to find out if there was a limit to the number of gremlins stuffed inside it. Wiping her brow, Bez wondered how much more of this adventure she could take. Curly let out a boisterous laugh as he kicked another gremlin away. Franklin ran until the heavy blanket of black sky fell upon him, and the lights holding up the night appeared far away. He walked small circles in the thick darkness, placing his hands on his head while catching his breath. Even the air he breathed in felt dense out here, but the doctor took comfort with the distant respite. He looked back to the center of the junkyard. His party was struggling in the light columns that encircled them, and little bloodthirsty horrors seemed to be everywhere. The sounds of screaming and yelling were distant but could not be unheard. The doctor shook his head and clenched his fists in frustration. The pull to help his group was as strong as the push to stay safely away from danger. "This isn't real. This is just a thing. This isn't real." Franklin repeated the short chant as he continued to walk his circles. He squeezed his eyes tight and held the sides of his head. In the darkness of his closed vision, the options button hovered faintly in the periphery. In the options menu, Franklin saw his chance to log out. Gremlin, tackle, versus Albrecht, intelligent dodge. 3 versus 7. Albrecht succeeds. Albrecht maintained sight of the gremlin and effortlessly predicted its movement. The fur was short enough to see its skin, and skin gave Albrecht all the insight he needed. As the mortician dodged the gremlin's attack, he saw the other gremlin woozily stand up from its face-planted position on the ground. Albrecht stood nimbly, semi-crouched with a wide stance. He counter-moved with the 2 growling gremlins as they attempted to flank either side of him. The first gremlin screamed and jumped at the mortician. Franklin, precision cut, versus gremlin, dodge. 4 versus 2. Franklin succeeds. Franklin burst forth from the darkness, barreling into the attacking gremlin. Tumbling with the large ball of fur and teeth, the doctor grabbed the top of the gremlin's head with one hand, then reached around with the other and sliced the gremlin's throat open. The diminutive beast fell, tongue lolling out, and the dark dust pouring from the neck wound. The doctor quickly stood over the dead goblin, holding the razor blade high in his hand. "Go for the neck!" Franklin called out to his companions. "Go for the neck!" Gremlin, tackle, versus Franklin, stamina. 3 versus 1. Franklin fails. 1 physical moxie strike inflicted. Without warning, the doctor found himself knocked to the ground in a struggle for his life. One of the solid little monsters dropped from a car stack and viciously tackled Franklin from behind. Razor-sharp teeth sunk deep into the medical examiner, drawing pain and blood in equal measures. Franklin yelled out in agony and struggled to get on his knees while stabbing in crazed desperation at the gremlin gnawing on his head. But system messages scrolled across Franklin's vision, notifying him of his failed attempts to wound the vicious gremlin. The gremlin changed its position and masticated the doctor's head with gluttonous vigor. Gremlin, tackle, versus Franklin, stamina. 3 versus 1. Franklin fails. 1 physical moxie strike inflicted. Pain coursed through his body and brought Franklin down to the ground again. Blinded by agony, the doctor trembled under the weight of the gremlin. In the periphery of his vision, a small indicator flashed red. It was a warning he had 1 moxie left. 1 more strike would be the end. "I see my night ending very soon." Franklin groaned quietly under the monster's weight and brutality. Albrecht heard Franklin's advice before being knocked to the ground. The mortician turned to the second gremlin and lunged for the neck with his scalpel. But the system indicated failure as the gremlin deftly rolled to the side, avoiding the attack.
"Worth a try,"
Albrecht grumbled. Gremlin, tackle, versus Albrecht, intelligent dodge. 2 versus 7. Albrecht demonstrates exceptional success. +1 modifier to next action.
"I better get that modifier on my next move," muttered Albrecht as the gremlin stumbled, rolled, and fell face first in the dust, just past the mortician. Curly fired off another round at a pair of eye lights that were closing in from the dark. A system message indicated success as the cowboy watched the pair of lights disappear. "Well, thank you kindly."
Curly took a step back and bumped into Albrecht's back. He glanced briefly at Albrecht, then readied his weapon for another shot.
"Just saying."
Curly's drawl was thick as he scanned for the next best target.
"Skills are mighty helpful, especially the stabbing ones."
Albrecht's mind was clouded with the struggles of his group. He watched the gremlin rise from its prone position and felt the pressure of time being squeezed into a period too small to manage. Albrecht closed his eyes and pulled up his hero sheet. He swiftly distributed his upgrade points into a new skill. Albrecht, new base skill developed. Cut, level D2. The associated attribute is nimbleness. Albrecht, cut, upgraded to D4. Eyes open, the gremlin was upon him. Albrecht reacted instinctively, employed his newly developed skill. Albrecht, cut, +1 modifier, versus gremlin, dodge. 7 versus 3. Albrecht succeeds. The scalpel plunged deep into the gremlin's neck. Albrecht twisted the small blade and swung hard to the left. The gremlin spewed an arc of black dust as it spun to the ground. The mortician stood over the dead gremlin, chest heaving intensely and smiling at the success. Another growling scream preceded another charging gremlin as it burst out from the shadows. Gremlin, tackle, versus Bizarria, vanishing act. 4 versus 2. Bizarria fails. 1 physical moxie strike inflicted. Bizarria reached into her jacket for the magic hat as she attempted to vanish, but did not act fast enough. The monster struck hard, causing the magician to tumble and roll across the powdered dirt with the gremlin latched onto her head. The impact knocked the flat magic hat out of the Magi's grasp, and the black disc rolled away from her like a lost coin. A system warning flashed small and red in the corner of Bizarria's vision, indicating she was on her last moxie. Alberic's smile dropped as he looked to either side. On one side was Bizarria, screaming at the gremlin tangled in her hair. On the other side lay Franklin, struggling to rise from the ground while the gremlin pressed deeper into his skull. Curly continued to fire at the advancing gremlins, but more dim lights were blinking from the surrounding car stacks. Time slowed as Albrecht realized he was being forced to choose. Who was he going to help, Bizarria or Franklin? Whoever he helped, there was a chance the other could die, but if he didn't choose now, both would surely be lost to him. Albrecht looked to one, then the other. He needed to choose now. Bizarria thrashed back violently against the gremlin on her head. Desperately, the magician waved her hand and spun around with a flourish of her jacket. Bizarria, Vanishing Act, versus Gremlin, Tackle. 3 versus 3, Error. The magician completed her spin, and then she and the squealing gremlin on her head were gone. Albrecht blinked a couple times to make sure his vision was clear, unsure of what just happened. Yet, sure enough, Bizarria the Magi and the gremlin had vanished from sight. Perplexed but rushed, Albrecht was grateful the Magi made a choice for him. The mortician sprinted to assist Franklin. The doctor made another attempt to rise. From his knees, Franklin wearily reached over his head in a forlorn attempt to throw the gremlin off. Failure scrolled by as the claws and teeth dug deep, resisting Franklin's feeble attempt. Franklin was back on all fours, struggling not to fall prone. The gremlin changed position and reared back, razor-filled mouth wide open, ready to deliver its final blow. Albrecht, cut, versus gremlin, dodge. 5 versus 2, Albrecht succeeds. Yelling defiantly, the old man rushed forward and sliced the monster's throat wide open. Dark dust spewed from the gash, and the gremlin fell back, releasing Franklin's head. Franklin remained on all fours for a moment, trembling with ragged breath. Closing his eyes, the doctor pushed the options button and focused on what he knew needed to be done. Franklin, new sub-skill developed. Mend, level D2. The associated attributes are research and forensics. Franklin opened his eyes and quickly identified nearby items he could use for mending wounds. The closest, most accessible gear he had were his shirt sleeves. With the help of his razor blade, the doctor cut off both shirt sleeves and quickly began patching his head wounds. His groans were divided equally between the pain of his injuries and the pain of rending his designer shirt. Franklin, mend. 4, success. Franklin, 1 physical moxie recovery. The doctor was now sleeveless, with cloth wrapped tightly around his head. Despite the pain, he felt slightly better, and the red moxie warning was no longer flashing in the corner of his vision. Albrecht placed a comforting hand on the doctor's shoulder, but the doctor did not respond. Franklin stared intently at a gremlin dancing and tumbling in front of the cowboy's pistol sights. The rest of the dim eye lights did not advance from their shadows. They didn't realize how quiet it had become until the mechanical whir resounded loudly throughout the junkyard. The companions jumped, and the yellow lights flickered in the distance. A wave of chittering and excited squeals rushed over the junkyard as the dim lights danced within the shadows of dead cars. The whir sounded again, higher-pitched and more intense, drowning the gremlin's excitement. The junkyard was pierced with the sound of sharp metal slowly being scraped hard and deep against old, flat metal. Albrecht's heart was thumping in his ears, and his focus scattered across the junkyard. His eyes were wildly flitting from car stack to the light to his companions, then to another car stack. The yellow light flickered once more, revealing the black silhouette of a tall, lean person stepping around a distant car stack. In one hand, a large, wicked hook that was dragged across one of the old metal cars, causing tiny sparks to shoot out from the point. At the end of the other arm, a large drill spun with a resounding mechanical whir. Smoothly, the tall man stepped into one of the pale light columns. Long, white, dusty pants led to a long, white lab coat. The coat was buttoned with dusty fringes at the bottom, yet it still appeared professional. A bright, white row of teeth shined through a smile that extended far beyond an average mouth. Albrecht was snatched by the grip of fear as he realized a nightmare had found him. Franklin spoke the words the mortician could not utter. "It's a dentist." The dentist's smile resembled that of the gremlin's, too wide for his face and too full of shiny teeth. However, his teeth were a brilliant white, not metallic. His drill and hook were like his smile, as they were too large for conventional use. The dentist wore a pair of round spectacles with lenses that reflected and shined brightly in the pale light. Albrecht stared into the pair of brilliantly reflective lenses, but could not see the dentist's eyes, only a wicked fire burning inside. "Albrecht," the dentist hissed, steadily moving closer. "Albrecht."
"This is a whole new level of trouble,"
muttered the cowboy as he quickly sized up the dentist. The infernal gremlin danced into Curly's view and cartwheeled across the front sight of his pistol. Blood simmering with his temper, the cowboy aimed his anger and fired at the gremlin. Failure scrolled by as the gremlin rolled away from the bullet. Cursing, Curly sprinted to a distant car stack, getting a good distance from the dentist while moving closer to the yellow light that Albrecht had identified. As the security guard ran, the gremlin jumped in an attempt to intervene. Without breaking stride, success scrolled across his vision as Curly punted the gremlin several feet away, leaving it sprawled in the dirt. The security guard slid behind a car stack and quickly checked how many rounds he had left in his revolvers.
"I've missed you, Albrecht,"
the dentist hissed slowly, carefully pronouncing each word. The nightmare did not heed the escaping cowboy as it strode closer to the mortician. Its movements were slow and methodical, yet they seemed to cover the distance with an unnatural speed.
"But I don't have my teeth,"
Albrecht cried out. The mortician quivered in fear as the dentist closed in and towered over him. Dentist Hook versus Albrecht Intelligent Dodge. 8 versus 4. Albrecht fails. 1 mental moxie strike inflicted. The hook caught Albrecht through the mouth and in the cheek, preventing him from getting away. Albrecht panicked as the nightmare took control, lifting the mortician to his toes.
"I need to look inside,"
the dentist hissed, crouching slightly below its raised arm so its face was level with Albrecht's. The mortician was caught like a fish at the end of a hook. He clawed and grasped at the dentist's arm, desperately trying to prevent his cheek from being torn apart. Franklin yelled and charged at the dentist with his razor blade in hand. Franklin, precision cut, versus dentist, predictive movement. 2 versus 6. Franklin fails. The dentist's movement appeared slow as his elongated appendages moved purposefully. Yet Franklin could not move fast enough to cut the nightmare. His razor blade sliced through the air, and Franklin's yell of courage waned into silence. The reflective lenses shined brightly, accentuating the dentist's placid regard as he looked upon Dr. Meadowlark. A chill hooked in deep and crawled up Franklin's spine as he looked at Albrecht. The mortician desperately grasped the dentist's elongated arm, struggling to stay on his toes. One of Albrecht's eyes locked with Franklin's horrified stare. The mortician fearfully reached out with one trembling arm, pleading. Eyes quivering, Franklin looked at Albrecht a moment longer. He mouthed a silent apology and then ran away. Curly locked back both revolvers and spun the cylinders. Smoothly, he leaned around the car stack and took aim at the dentist. A gremlin burst from around the car stack, interrupting Curly's aim. It was the same infernal gremlin he had just kicked away. Again, the system indicated Curly's success, and the gremlin met the same boot as before. In heated fury, the cowboy hollered, cursed, aimed, and fired at the kicked minion. Curly, quick draw, versus gremlin, dodge. 3 versus 3. Curly fails.
Dagnabbit!
It was the only curse the cowboy could express in his wild rage. Curly twirled his other revolver and took careful aim, but the gremlin moved faster than his pull of the trigger. The gremlin leaped, and the system indicated another successful kick, causing the aggressive furball to fall and roll over several times. It rolled back onto its feet and bounced, turning around to face the cowboy. Curly continued with his flow and changed his attack action. Instead of kicking the gremlin, Curly swept his other foot across the ground and kicked as much dust and dirt as possible into the gremlin's face. Curly, heel kick versus gremlin, dodge. 8 versus 2. Curly demonstrates exceptional success. +1 modifier to next action. The cowboy hooted with excitement at the exceptional success of his action while the little monster scrambled and screamed in furious circles, clawing at the brown dust caked in its eyes. The world around them was semi-muted, both in sight and sound. Everything was hazy and slightly drained of color, while the noises from their surroundings were muffled and slow. The gremlin stopped chewing on Bizarria's head, clearly perplexed by what it saw. While strange to those unfamiliar with it, the vanished state was something Bizarria had become very familiar with through her training as a magician. The Magi quickly took advantage of the gremlin's pause. With incredible display, especially for having a monster on her head, she twirled and flashed the knife from her jacket. Bizarria, throwing knives, versus gremlin, dodge. 3 versus 3. Bizarria fails. The circus magician cursed her innate showmanship as the flash of the knife put the gremlin back on edge. Keeping its claws firmly in the Magi's scalp, the furry monster reacted fast and dodged the knife strike. Its extreme movements caused Bizarria to sway and nearly lose her balance. Then the gremlin attempted to bite back. Gremlin, tackle, versus Bizarria, throwing knives. 4 versus 4. Bizarria succeeds. Reflexively, the Magi twisted and stabbed upward. Metal teeth clamped down on Bizarria's metal blade, preventing the final attack on her head. She pulled down for another strike, but the gremlin refused to release its bite. A tug-of-war quickly ensued on top of the Magi's head, with Bizarria struggling to pull her knife out of the gremlin's clamped jaws. Bizarria pulled hard at her knife, and the gremlin pulled back harder. Her disadvantage weighed heavily, with the gremlin still perched on her head. She refused to let go of the knife, as releasing the blade would undoubtedly be the end of her. Unless... The Magi released her grip on the knife, which caused the gremlin's head to fly back in the sudden loss of tension. It nearly lost its grip on the Magi's skull. As she released that knife, Bizarria used her free hand and drew another knife from her jacket. Another quick twirl was followed by a rapid stab upward. Bizarria, throwing knives, versus gremlin, dodge. 4 versus 2. Bizarria succeeds. The gremlin twitched heavily on Bizarria's head. A low growl rumbled from the creature above. Then, dark dust fell as the monster went limp, and the dagger fell from its teeth. Fear, anger, and determination flowed through the Magi. She withdrew her blade, then stabbed again, and again. Bez stabbed blindly overhead. The gremlin slumped, its dead weight pressing on her head and neck as dust and flaccid limbs covered her vision. She tore the monster off her head and threw it to the ground, screaming in fierce retribution. She struck another defiant blow into the rapidly decaying minion. Bizarria the Magi would not die today. Then, Bizarria felt the presence of something terrible watching her. She stopped screaming and slowly looked to her side. The world was clear with its color restored. Everything could be heard clearly. Long, lean, and white, the dentist stood slightly bent with head cocked to the side, as if silently asking a question. His glowing spectacles stared with curiosity at Bizarria the Magi, who had quite suddenly appeared nearby. Then she saw Albrecht. Albrecht was dangling like a fish caught on the dentist's hook. The mortician desperately grasped at the dentist's arm, straining to keep his cheek from being ripped open. He couldn't turn his head, but out of the corner of one eye, he saw Bizarria. Their eyes locked, and she was struck motionless with terror. Albrecht tried to call out to her, but the noises he made were pitiful, wet, and unintelligible. The red Moxie warning still flashed in Bizarria's periphery. She covered her mouth with both hands and shook her head in fear and sorrow. Then she turned and quickly ran away. Albrecht's grip slipped as his companions, one by one, turned and ran away in his time of desperation. With all chances of help gone, he felt an empty void begin to consume what life he held inside. The mortician growled against the desperation, strengthened his grip, and gathered his wits in an attempt to fight the abandonment taking hold of his mind and heart. He heaved and attempted to extricate himself from the hook. Albrecht, intelligent dodge, versus dentist, hook. 5 versus 8. Albrecht fails. The dentist lifted Albrecht higher, causing his toes to lose contact with the ground. The nightmare leaned in close and shined his tooth-filled smile upon Albrecht. Chidingly, the dentist waved his drill back and forth, set Albrecht on his feet, and then proceeded to drill in Albrecht's mouth. Dentist, drill, versus Albrecht, intelligent dodge. 10 versus 6. Albrecht fails. 1 physical moxie strike inflicted. Albrecht screamed out in blood-curdling pain as his moxie warning flashed red.